should I have like a zero
Welcome to MediaPath. I'm Fritz Coleman.
And I'm Louise Palanker.
MediaPath has been deemed the greatest barometer of current culture since the Met Gala. And some people only listen to us wearing very expensive fashions.
Yeah.
On each episode, we offer you suggestions on great viewing or listening, recent releases, even old releases, only recently rediscovered by us. We use these interesting contents to lead into our spectacular guests, and we have a couple today. This time we have Herbie J. Pilato, an author of, he says, somewhere between 16 and 20 books, he's not sure, on classic television.
Yeah, he's writing one right now.
And he had a talk show host. One of the titles he's most proud of is he's a retired NBC page. It's like being a Marine. You're never not an NBC page. You just become inactive as an NBC page. And I knew Herbie back when he was an active NBC page. We're going to talk to Herbie about his latest book called Retroactive Television, an in-depth retrospective on classic TV's social circuitry. The fantastic foreword in this book was written by the talented Eric Scott. Eric, as you know, was Ben Walton on the Waltons, one of America's most iconic television series. And for today, MediaPath has become Walton Mountain because Ben is with us right here in the studio. That'll be an amazing conversation. But first, Wheezy, I have a review.
Oh.
And there are so few, I thought
I'd
I
love
would
to hear it. Thank you.
Give you this one right now. This is this is hot off the presses.
Yeah.
The title of the review is Inspiring Listeners with Timely Topics and Great Hosts. I love this podcast. Fritz and Louise are top talent that bring their A game to every episode. Their guest list is incredible, and there's always a lesson to be learned. I always find myself inspired and uplifted, and often giggling at these real conversations. So refreshing, says Jeanette Bernstein. God love you, Jeanette, and everything you stand for.
It sounds like you just reviewed the Waltons.
No.
There's always a lesson.
Wow.
Inspiring.
Yep. All right, what do you got, Wheeze?
Oh, Fritz, I'm assuming that the iconic Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret was never on your reading list? Is that correct?
No. I know it's famous. I know it's
So-
important in American female tween culture, but I've never read one.
So you may be wondering, who is this Margaret and why is she questioning the presence of God? Well, Margaret Simon is almost 12 when she moves to the New Jersey suburbs with her parents, an only child. She eagerly joins a secret club of girls who begin sharing notes on boys and bras and periods. Concerned that she is not measuring up, Margaret begins a conversation with God within which she addresses her compounding concerns. This frank and touching middle grade book was first published in 1970, and it immediately charted on both bestseller and banned book lists. And this month, at long last, just as the banned book craze is once again cresting, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret is a movie. The film arrives more than half a century after the book, much longer than Margaret waited for her period. Here, we get to see our childhood decors and wardrobe spring back to life with a cast that includes Rachel McAdams as Margaret's mom, Benny Safdie as her dad, Kathy Bates as her grandmother, and Abby Ryder Forston as Margaret. She is exquisitely expressive. Each of the primary female characters in the film, Margaret, her mother, and her grandmother, are navigating new chapters and finding purpose and identity and meeting with the support of one another. Throughout the decades, Judy Blume's books have boldly discussed the once taboo teen topics of sexuality, gender dynamics, religious choices, and adolescent confusion. Her words have served as welcome reassurance to fearful children working their way through puberty. The concept of a period can be terrifying to a young girl. No one speaks about the specifics out loud. It's all whispered. I first became aware as a tiny kid with 3 equally young siblings in a moment when my overwhelmed mother was dashing around the house partially clothed in an effort to wrangle us into momentary safety. I noticed that she had hurriedly stuffed some toilet paper into her crotch. She was bleeding from there, and I was scared. She told me not to worry, and it would eventually happen to me. I'm sorry, what? That's not comforting. Unlike Margaret, I was in no hurry for this eventuality. Judy's books were a gift as she calmly explained what was happening to our bodies in a way that helped us feel less isolated and more a part of the natural cycle of life. And Margaret is struggling with more than just the physical aspects of becoming her grown-up self. She is also seeking spiritual answers in her communications with God. Her mother is Christian, her father is Jewish. They have encouraged her to choose her own faith. It's a daunting expectation. This aspect of the book alone fueled the Christian right to ban it. They demand absolute certainty when it comes to beliefs. No questions, just blind faith. Judy Blume says that things are worse now than when the book was first targeted by the right-wing religious groups. Now, all three branches of government are involved in curtailing our right to wonder and ask and read and learn. And I have even more exciting Judy Blume news for you, Fritz, because I know she is... Hold on.
Hello.
It's spam risk.
That was for me.
So, Fritz, Judy Blume has a new documentary on Prime, and it's called Judy Blume Forever. What is Judy Blume really like? She is exactly as you always hoped. Her life, her history, her opinions, her motivations, inspirations, and personality are documented here in a Ron Howard, Brian Grazer film, which you'll find on Prime. How did this kind, thoughtful, diminutive, almost shy woman change the way young girls awaken into their grown-up selves? She pushed back against the traditional female expectations of her young adult era in a way which best suited her personality. She began quietly writing. In Judy Blume Forever, you'll meet her kids, her husband, her friends, and most astoundingly, two young ladies with whom Judy has been corresponding since they began writing to her as children. When Judy's words first met the eyes of kids, the questions she answered inspired more questions, and so they wrote. Every child's perspective and experiences are different. They all have questions, and I would like to encourage you to be the person who answers the questions of the children in your life. Start by asking them questions. Tell them about your childhood. That's how you open up pathways of safe communication. There is a kid right now who needs your experience, understanding, and wisdom. Judy Blume Forever is on Prime. Are you there, God? It's me. Margaret is in theaters, streaming soon. I'm not sure where, but we'll let you know. And the book, of course, is everywhere. Fritz?
I think the book banning is going to come back to bite these people in the rear end in the end. It's just awful. It's regressing back into the 1800s, you know?
And it's imagining that they can't find the book online.
No, it's just bad.
You can no longer contain information. That's why they're becoming increasingly desperate to try.
So sad. Well, I'm going to do a documentary about rock and roll. This is streaming on Amazon Prime and Apple TV. It's Little Richard, and the title is I Am Everything. I'm a huge fan of music documentaries. This one is about the innovator, the emancipator, the originator, the architect of rock and roll, Little Richard Penniman. This film is advertised as the black queer origins of rock and roll. Little Richard is one of the most copied early artists in rock and roll. His songs have been covered by many, many artists. Some would call it appropriation. We had this discussion on the air with Pat Boone. He would not call it appropriation. He said that Pat Boone made him rich because Pat Boone introduced other people, particularly white people, to his music. This is about a gifted yet very conflicted star. He bounced back and forth between God and sex and rock and roll, between gay sex and straight sex, between a gay identity and a straight identity, between gospel and what was labeled the devil's music, rock and roll. He was discovered as a gifted singer by the iconic blues shouter Sister Rosetta Tharpe. She put him on stage at one of her shows, and the rest is history. Richard ended up singing in a slightly different type of venue, starting in drag shows in his hometown of Macon, Georgia, and later on the Chitlin circuit, he sang in drag as Princess Lavon. After he recorded and got famous, he was recognized as the Black Liberace. And this, to me, was the most interesting part of this whole film. The fact that his character was feminine made white people more comfortable with him because he did not fill that subliminal stereotype of the handsome, muscular black man who was out to convert white women away from black women. And it made him more comfortable.
Away from white men.
Yeah, right. Or both. In other words, he wasn't
He wasn't a threat to white men.
Thank you. Some of the lyrics of his songs had to be changed because they were crude and rude. For instance, Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy. That song was originally Tutti Frutti, good booty. It was a song about gay sex, and they had to change the words before they would record it. Zaldina Robinson, a writer and a scholar, says in that film that the South is the home of all things queer. And by queer, she doesn't necessarily mean gay. It means anything that is just different. Richard struggled his whole life to be accepted for who he was, and the hardest fight was with himself. He just wanted to be loved. Love had been denied to him since he was a child, except by his mother. He was one of 12 children, and his father threw him out of the house because he was gay, but here's the dark irony, let him back in the house when he started making hit records and making money. His father owned a nightclub, and Little Richard's records were hot in the nightclub, so he let him move back in the house as a gay man.
Did you notice that they kind of skimmed past the part where Little Richard's friend kills his father?
Oh, yeah. The family dynamics are
There's
crazy.
more of a story there. Because I think his father was cruel. Maybe it was a boyfriend, and it was just like...
Well, his father was as conflicted as he was. His father was a preacher, plus he was a nightclub owner, may or may not have been running hookers out of the nightclub, so his father was just as conflicted as he was.
So the question for me, from me to you, Fritz, is... Do you think, because it's a story of extremes, like he's got his steering wheel and he's either pulling it hard to the left or hard to the right. Like he's not able to find balance because, so if people were allowed to just be themselves, like if how he wanted to dress and who he fell in love with and all that and was attracted to, if all of that was fine, would he have had that much conflict regarding his evangelical teachings?
I don't know.
As a child?
That's a great question. I do know that he used to have orgies with both men and women, but have the Bible in the bed with him while he had the orgies. He was a very conflicted man.
That is the definition
of conflict. If we could just stop for a second where I could quote Deuteronomy here before we finish. Anyway, he was but a gentle soul, and there are sound bites in here where he admits his failings, and he was a great performer. Mick Jagger said he was the guy that taught him how to use the entire stage. Nigel Rodgers, who is a great producer and also one of the members of Chic, produced David Bowie's record. And he said David Bowie's biggest wish in life was to sound like Little Richard. So he's had an incredible, and the Beatles opened for him on a European tour. So he was an incredible person and very sad. Did you find, were you sort of melancholy at the end of the movie?
Very sad, because he could not escape his own fear of the hereafter, because he just thought that like having the Bible in the room is like during an orgy is like asking for forgiveness while you're doing the sin.
It was crazy.
And so that's very painful to watch. But also watching in 2 hours, watching side by side Little Richard, and then all of the acts that came out in the 80s. Everybody who was much more free with how they presented themselves, if they felt like dressing like Elton John or whoever. You just see it's clear as day the influences that he was way ahead of that curve.
Right. You're absolutely right. Let's get to our guest before we get bored with listening to us pontificate. Well, Herbie J. Pilato has been a friend of mine for a long time. He is a prolific author. Nobody knows more facts and people involved in classic television than Herbie. He's written, I think it's 16 books we decided on. He also hosted a talk show about classic television on Amazon Prime called Then Again with Herbie J. Pilato. We're going to talk to him about his most recent interesting book, Retroactive Television, an in-depth perspective on classic TV's social circuitry. And the person that wrote the great foreword to this book is none other than Ben Walton, Eric Scott. Eric appeared in all things Walton through the years, starting with the origin story of the Waltons' Homecoming, A Christmas Story in 1971. He's also been seen on many other classic TV venues, Bewitched and The Fall Guy and Medical Center and The Doris Day Show. And we have them both in the studio, and we're so happy to have you guys. I just hope we don't run out of time before we finish asking you guys questions.
I'll keep quiet. You talk.
All right, let me ask you.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, you're so very welcome.
Quite
It's
an
an honor.
introduction. I don't know between the movies.
Before we get into the weeds with Herbie's book, I want to ask you about Ben Walton. Ben Walton, in all the descriptions, was sort of the idealist of the family. But I want you to describe who this character was and how he fit in the family puzzle there.
Well, I think that as the producers saw that we had so many kids, they watched us as people, and they started picking up on some nuances that we might have shown them on the set. And for myself, I always liked business, and they followed that a little bit with Ben. He worked in the wood mill, sawmill with Daddy, and worked with John Boy when he was working on the Chronicle, doing his newspaper. So Ben got himself involved with whatever was going on the mountain.
So that's very interesting. Your personal life dictated how the writers
I think it helped them.
Character.
It helped them. There was a lot of differences that they changed and took along the way. But for us, you know, I know that there was a couple of episodes about my height and a couple of things that they dealt with, and so they picked up on that, and I was very comfortable with that. So they
Which
came to
I
me.
identified with in that one episode.
Did you?
Oh, very
When
much. I thought that was a big deal.
Yeah, when I got the little heels and
Yeah.
put them on to be taller and stuff. Yeah. So, but I was very comfortable with all that, and so they embraced it and let us go with it. And then Ben later on, when he went off to the war and stuff, it was a lot of different things that they were able to add to his character. So I was very appreciative of that.
And then Weezy's got tons of questions. She's got all sorts of things to talk to you about. But I wanted to say about the war, because I think we've had other discussions about the great television of the late 60s and 70s and how it's sort of plugged into the American zeitgeist. I think the Waltons, Little House on the Prairie, some of these shows that showed strong families against the adversity of life came at exactly the right moment, because we were in the midst of the Vietnam War. We'd never been more separated as a culture as we were then. So I think that, and you going off to war sort of was a different reflection on that whole topic. And I just think it was so important to have this type of writing and this type of tight family commitment at a time when we seem to be coming apart at the seams.
Oh, I think it was why it was brought on. There was a whole conversation between the government at that time and TV, and they wanted to show a different angle and have family shows again that were going to be a little bit more wholesome. So the Waltons were put on against Flip Wilson and Mod Squad, two powerhouses, but very different types of entertainment. And lo and behold, the show actually was in last place the first week it was on the air, and the end of the first season. We were, I think, number one that week. And we also had, I think it was 11 Emmy nominations, and that was the beginning of its rise.
It's kind of like that warm fire that's in the corner of the room that you don't quite notice it's there, and then eventually everyone winds up gathered around it.
It was
It happened
every week.
because of the homecoming.
Well, the homecoming was the impetus for the series, but again, it was just I remember CBS, they were talking at the time, and they wanted to bring on a show that would bring family values. And you know, we look now 50 years later, and it's very timely to be talking about these things too.
Well, it was so relatable because the characters were not cookie cutter, and they were real. They got upset with each other. They cried. They got angry. The parents got angry at the children. You just really didn't see that on TV before. There was the Brady Bunch and the Partridge Family, which was their own thing.
And you had a teenage character who quoted literature. And so there were a lot of kids that really related to that. He was a different type of hero.
Well, we weren't creating popular characters. They became popular, but they weren't that phototypical type of, oh, this is the way a family would be on TV. In fact, it was never seen like that before. So we were very lucky. And then, you know, having Earl Hamner on the set, and it was his family, and he took some creative license along the way, but he definitely allowed the family to shine on a level that no one had ever seen a family before. Mm-hmm. So we were honored.
How did they go out of their way, the producers and writers and Earl, to make sure that even though you kids had jobs to do, that you also got to experience your childhood?
Well, I that's a good question. Unfortunately, that's not their problem. Mm. You know, you're working, and your job is to show up on time, and to not be difficult, and to do the job that's asked of you. You're going into an adult world. And for myself, I was 12 when I did the homecoming, and I worked and went to Pierce College at nighttime to get my degree after high school, and I did that, and we filmed until I was 23. So you do what you got to do and as far as filling it to have a child, I didn't realize how much I missed until I had kids myself. Okay. And then I realized that I missed the high school proms and the graduations and stuff. And I have 3 kids, so I've seen it with them. And I didn't have the opportunity to go off to a 4-year college. I was filming. So all 3 kids my youngest is right now finished his first year at Syracuse. Oh. And our middle one is at University of Denver, and she's going to be a senior. And our eldest got her master's, and and she just got married a couple months ago.
Oh, my goodness.
So
Your job here is done, Dad.
Well,
Hit the Barca Lounge room.
Is it really ever done?
No, it's not.
I don't think it is.
The
I'm just
monthly
honored.
requests.
But I do realize how much we missed. But fortunately, I was on a set with a lot of other kids.
That's the
Most
thing.
other shows I was on, I was the only kid on there.
Yeah.
You know, I did, like you mentioned, the medical center. I remember I did that episode, and it was with Steve Lawrence, and it was a wonderful episode, but I was the only kid on the set. And that was the way it was for most of my experience on TV.
Did you have
we
the on-set tutors that was the...
Yeah, they always had teachers for us. I carried a little bit heavy load for my education, so they had to have a second and a third teacher for me. Wow. Because I was taking German and I was taking some advanced math classes. Oh. So the regular teacher was there for the rest of the kids, and then they brought in 2 other teachers for me. So they provide what you need for a good education. So they took care of us on that. But as far as the social part, that's up to you to figure out.
But you know what? You all turned out okay. You know, like a lot of former child actors who did not.
I've always said the child stars, it's very much like the public. You know, we always talk about the ones that have gone wrong. That's human nature to talk about those things. There's a lot of wonderful people that have been in TV or in movies that turned out just fine. But we always want to focus on the negative and the heartbreaking stories that are out there, the Judy
Some of it is
Garlands
a
and
product
stuff.
of the relationship with a parent and a child, right?
Absolutely.
How much of this was their own decision to go into show business?
I was very fortunate. I had a very, very strong mom that was there for me. She came on the set every day until I was 18 years of age. It was a conversation we would have before I got into the business of, is it something I want to do? And she was there. She stopped working as a bookkeeper, and I paid her to come on the set with me. But I went home and I did my chores and cleaned up after the dog and cleaned my room on Saturdays. And I did everything that I was. And I went through Boy Scouts. I'm an Eagle Scout, so there was some normalcy that was put in. But it's an unusual situation, and then you've got a lot of power, especially with parents that aren't as strong as my mom, where they look at the numbers, the money coming in or whatever, so they start making changes in their lifestyle as a family. Well, I didn't have that. My mom and dad were very supportive of keeping our family the same way. I did buy cars for them, which was unusual. I helped my older brother with getting a car and bought a TV for the family. So I was very generous, I felt, but I also it was my career, and I wasn't supporting my family. And so I was very fortunate that I had a family that...
So you really had the best of both worlds, Eric?
I think so.
In many ways.
I think so.
Well, one of the things I wanted to talk about in light of Herbie's book and the framework that he's looking at is sort of this feedback loop of how does TV influence us and how do we influence the shows that come on the air as a society. And you were not just consuming television like any kid, you were creating it. So how did creating it affect how you enjoyed it or what you got out of it when you watched it?
Well, as an actor, when you're making a production, you're not thinking about the end product at all. You're there for the moment. I would look at the first year. I looked at the shows just to see how the editing was done and the post-production was done. But after that, I didn't usually watch them very closely because they could skew you. They could, change the way you might do things in the future. Also, the response that the public was going to get from it, I didn't watch that either. Mm-hmm. So I still watched my usual shows,
right? So
and enjoyed them.
But were you more aware of how shows are created and therefore like a little bit more? I'm not sure, judgmental about the content.
I think once you've been on a set, you learn that it's make believe. Mm-hmm. So. I would watch them, and my game was always, do I know the line first? I would always say the line before the actor would say the line.
Really?
Yeah. So I got pretty good at that. But I also saw the technical side if they, made a bad shot or if it was a bad, a bad cut on the editing side. So, yeah, you become very technical when you're doing it all the time. Mm-hmm. But that's just me.
Yeah.
Herbie, what classifies as classic television? Just old, the sepia tone past, or is it something that's stuck with the American public?
Both. Really. I mean, if it has to be good and old to make it classic. And I stick with the book I addressed, the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, a little bit of the 80s. But the 50s, 60s, and 70s, to me, those are ideal classic eras with classic shows. Seinfeld became the new classic. Frasier, the new classic. Reba, which is one of my favorites, was the last, in my opinion, the last family sitcom. That's a new classic.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the music went that way too with the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable what happened with music, but we'll stick with TV.
But what your book did was show some of these transitions. You talk about the start of the sitcom in '49. You talk about the start of the variety television in the late 40s and how that's morphed into like The Voice and America's Got Talent and all that kind of stuff now. It's just, there are no new ideas, just reconfigurations of them.
Yes, and there's a lot, and I talk about this a lot, but there's a lot of talent in today's television, both in front of and behind the cameras. But what I'm not seeing and what I just so love about the classic shows is charm. There's just so much charm to the older shows where everybody is more likable and they're still dimensional, but they're not as mean-spirited or as sardonic as many of the characters, not all, but many of the characters have become today.
You had a great quote from Red Skelton in there that what seems to be missing, especially when he was at the end of his career, but now more so. Now there is a missing aspect of laughter with tears. Red Skelton made you laugh, but he made you cry. Jackie Gleason, that bartender character he did, would make you laugh, but it was also a very empathetic character. And you don't see that. Now everything is so dark and cutting and, the writing. I think one of the best written shows on television is Succession, but no family talks to one another that way because they're left in a bloody pool at the end of the show. They're just, they trash one another. There's no, as Red Skelton said, laughter with tears.
Wow, there's no dimension. For some reason, it is a bad thing to have at least a happy ending. I don't see a lot of happy endings on shows today. If there is some kind of joyful moment that some of these new characters, or name it, of a drama or any comedy sometimes, if there is a joyful moment at the end, someone will then run into the room and say, "Oh, wait, Bob just got stabbed." And that's...
Suck the life out of the room. Yeah.
Oh, no, Bob.
And that's how
Okay,
it
but
ends.
Herbie, so during the pandemic, did you notice that during the Emmys, Ted Lasso wins everything, even though I don't think the performances were the best since they were up against Henry and he was the best. But that was the year we just needed niceness. We just needed...
Ted Lasso I love that show.
It's great, but did it need to win everything? We were so hungry for what Herbie's talking about, for just people to be kind.
Right.
And for kindness to win.
It kind of goes to that. We're in the anti-hero era now, starting with The Sopranos, where the guys who are ugly, but they have a pleasant side because they go to a therapist. but there's all. I mean, there's shows like Shameless on Showtime. I loved all the performances. I wanted to bathe after I watched that show. It was so dark and we're just in a period of darkness. I hope we swing the other direction.
I think we are going to. I think it's going that way, especially because there's so many of the classic TV channels now that the younger generation is watching. They're watching Batgirl, watching Bewitched, the Waltons. And they're seeing the different comparisons. They're physically seeing that these shows are lit brighter. Everything is darkly lit.
Oh,
and
no,
that
that's interesting.
the actors are speaking with diction, and you can understand them. Not everybody's mumbling.
So it's kind of like, it's not just like, is the show good? It's also, how does this show make me feel? How do I feel when I'm watching
Yes.
it? You can watch Mayberry on a loop all day long and you'll just feel good.
Yes, it's true.
And
It's
Eric
true.
and I were talking before the show. He made a great comment that we're talking about all these new venues for the older shows. MeTV, Antenna TV,
Cozy.
Cozy. And Eric said there are more people seeing his show on a weekly basis now than saw it when it was at its peak.
Yeah, if it's
and they're on 7 days a week.
We're on 7 days a week, 5 or 6 different networks, 4 or 5 times a day. So if you add all that up, and it's now across, it's global now,
and you can stream it.
And it's streamed, it's on demand, it's every way you can. So more people are probably consuming the Waltons now than when it was first done back in the 70s.
And I'll bet they are. And I'll bet the Waltons and the Andy Griffith Show and some of these softer shows, not soft in content, but gentler, more human, because of the darkness that we find ourselves in our current world. I think people seek that out because it's like a warm hug.
Well, I think that people watch sometimes to be entertained. And when you're going through the world right now that we have, and it's rough, and I feel I have so much empathy for the people that are just trying to get by. And, when they get home, and we were just out the other day to Lincoln, Illinois last week, and just meeting the fans. And you can tell after the rough life that they're having just to get home, and after they put their kids to bed, every night they just want to go to bed and have a smile on their face. Yes. It's back to the watch our show. And I'm so glad that they're getting a gift now that we did 50 years ago. We're honored by that. But it makes you wonder what's going on in our world.
Well, not only that, now what's the opposite effect of that? What are the people feeling that are watching the edgy shows and the darkness and the... What's the opposite effect? That's the scary thing.
I remember Breaking Bad came out, and it took me a few years to want to get into it because everyone was saying it was the best out. And I watched it. I did watch the whole thing. It was brilliant. However, I felt like a shower was needed. I could never watch more than one episode. This binging, I don't understand people how they could do more than one. I'd have to get up for it. My wife and I would watch it, and afterwards I would go, oh.
But it seems like it desensitizes you, and maybe you go online and post something nasty instead of, why don't you just keep that thought to yourself? You just hurt someone's feelings.
But what is the impact of it?
Yeah. So let's talk real quick about the urban-rural divide, because I never gave it any thought as a child. I was a suburban kid. But there was an interesting quote in your book from Paul Harvey regarding your show of shows, which I always thought of, it's before my childhood, but I always thought of as a classic. But here you had a guy saying something about how these urban, what he meant was Jews, I think that was a subtext, think this is funny. And then we had, all the rural shows, which were extremely popular. And then all of a sudden there was the Rural Purge and they were canceled. Then they put the Waltons on. But was that always going on? Were there always people who felt like folks in big cities didn't really ever on television speak to their way of life or their values?
Well, I mean, going back to Amos and Andy, when that show was considered racist in many ways, and yet the people involved with that show, the African-American actors, were devastated when that show was canceled because that was their livelihood.
They just didn't like it when white guys played the black guys.
Well, that was only on the radio, but that was bad.
But when it came on screen, these were African American, and they dealt with racism in the show. Mm-hmm. So that was a very odd situation. I grew up in the inner city of Rochester, New York. My parents had nothing. We were a big Italian family, had 10 brothers and sisters on each side. So I, was gravitated towards the TV, towards escapism, towards Bewitched, Star Trek, whatever was going on in the 60s, like everybody did in general, because the 60s was a tough time. So television doesn't necessarily reflect the era of the shows that are on at that time. It's kind of like 10 years later, but in the meantime, it did what all entertainment has done since the beginning of time, going back to, the Greeks and then flashing forward to the, 30s and vaudeville and Broadway. People always wanted to escape, but I don't see that television today.
A little bit, though. Okay, so Ted Lasso, I think that started a trend. Rob Lowe has a show called something, I'm not sure, but it's a similar tone, and then Shrinking.
Do they break character?
Yeah.
Do they break character? Do they stay in character? Do they wink at the camera? Do they, always... There's this new kind of acting where everybody has these twitches where I don't know, maybe I should do it. I don't know. What do you think? Nobody... Nobody gives a performance anymore. They're too busy trying to play to the camera or trying to do stand-up comedy in the middle of a drama, and I'm just not sure what I'm watching. So,
well, you have to. Shrinking with Harrison Ford he's good.
Amazing.
He is really, really.
Does
good
he play
in
it straight? Is
Yeah,
it a
very.
straight character all the way through?
He's having fun.
He's laconic.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a vocabulary word from high school that I just got to use in a sentence.
Say thank you.
Yeah, they have their own tone in the way that they rattle off lines to one another in sarcastic.
But his charm is
very
real high.
charming.
Very high.
Okay. I'll give it a shot. But every time I try to watch something, though, in the
I get
newer
it.
shows,
I understand.
there's commercials. And then I'm like, 27 commercials. I'm like, wait a minute, what was I watching? And I forget. And then I really, really, really want to like the new shows, but it's very difficult for me. It's very difficult to me because I do not see the charm. I will give all of these new shows that you young people are talking about. But I will give it a chance, but so far, Reba, to me, I mentioned it before, was the last great family sitcom.
I love Reba.
Oh my gosh, what a series. And Frasier, the last great sophisticated sitcom.
Well,
They
I'm
rebooted Frasier.
Yes.
My ex-wife went to a taping, said it's funnier than it was the first time. Will and Grace, she went to a taping of that show, said it's funnier than it was
Will
the
and
first
Grace
time.
I'm a Will and Grace person. I could watch that all day, every day. It makes me laugh every time. It's groundbreaking. And in terms of like the feedback loop between us and what we're watching, revolutionary and beautiful.
Night Court is back and doing really well.
So I want to talk for a moment, Herbie, because you sat down and had really interesting conversations with lots of people for this book. You talked to creators, you talked to their children, and you posed probably your questions and through this framework of how did your programming affect society? And so tell us about some of the highlights of some of your conversations.
Well, it was really great to speak with Ed Spielman, first of all. He created Kung Fu. And Bruce Lee, I want to make that clear, Bruce Lee did not create Kung Fu. Ed Spielman and Howard Friedlander created Kung Fu in the 1960s. So to have this kind of, and I did the Kung Fu Book of Wisdom and the Kung Fu Book of Cain, so that's why I had a chance to sit down with Ed and talk in depth. He was excited to talk about it because he felt that the television of yesterday was what I've been saying. You know, it was so impactful, and he brought it. He brought a dimension to the book, a validity to it that I really, really felt it needed, and I was just completely taken back by
So cool.
him.
That's so cool that you got to have that conversation.
What was the attraction to the Kung Fu genre? Was it the martial arts? Was it the morality in there? Or?
Well, it was an odd thing because David Carradine debuted with Kung Fu in 1972, just as President Nixon was holding historic conversations with China's Chairman Mao. And there was the hippie movement. And David Carradine was kind of like a hippie on TV. He walked barefoot. He showed up on Merv Griffin one day barefoot.
He was kind of like Jesus.
Very Jesus-esque, no doubt about it. And it introduced mainstream America to Asian thought. It introduced mainstream America to New Age thought. And there was also some controversy because he wasn't Asian. You know, why didn't they get an Asian actor? Bruce Lee auditioned for the role. He was considered too tough. But the character of Kwa Chang Caine was always half Asian and always half American. So they wanted someone more tranquil, number one. Also, too, at the time, television was just not ready for an Asian character. It just, as a lead, it just wasn't going to happen. But what Kung Fu did for supporting actors of the Asian American community, it gave more work to actors like Benson Fong and James Hong, Mako. All of these amazing Asian Americans were playing characters for the first time that were not stereotypical. So I get a little upset when people put Kung Fu down and say that it, didn't do this, it didn't do. It did a lot.
Now the best part about it is we would play on the sets during the lunch.
Yeah?
Yeah, because it was filmed
right next door.
Wow.
So it was they called it the Lost Horizon set.
Yes.
And that's where we would play on the exterior. And then when every once in a while they would go for the interior, and we go over there, and they were busy lighting the candles because, there was a lot of candles in some of those scenes.
Was it grasshopper
candles.
scenes?
Yeah, of course. So
Flashbacks.
we of course would go and play around with the sets. So for us, we loved Kung Fu because it was a lot different than Walton's Mountain.
That is so cool. That is so cool. No, it was an awesome show, and it was only, I think, 3 years, and they were the first one to do the slow motion effect, which was supposed to tone down the violence a little bit. And then the $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman picked up on that, and, as well as the Incredible Hulk and all pretty much adventure shows. But what was great about it is, as violent as Kung Fu was, they only did the Kung Fu towards the end of the episode, just like Samantha would only twitch toward the end of the episode, just like Steve and Jamie would only do their bionics towards the end of the episode, so people would have something to anticipate, where they wouldn't get tired of seeing the action, which you see all the time, to the point of where, okay, so what?
It's a
and
more thoughtful
everybody's a
violence
martial
at the end
artist
of
now.
the show.
It's like a song. It should be a slow build.
Yes, then this is what's missing too.
The Barry Manilow method.
Yeah, is that
Mandy.
slow build exactly correct?
And these days, David Carradine would never be cast on that part because Hollywood
No,
would explode.
it would not happen today, but it would not happen back in '72 to have Bruce Lee. It just wasn't going to happen. So he paved the way. And by the way, because of Bruce Lee's rejection from Kung Fu, he went back to his homeland of China and became a martial arts legend. So that wouldn't have happened if he didn't get rejected.
Okay.
But I'll tell you, again, going back to the Waltons and talking about
It
casting.
all comes back to the one.
It always does,
Well,
especially
most things
today.
do.
But we did a show which we were having a Native American on the show, and it was in the barn. He thought that there was some ancient burial grounds there and everything else, so they brought a wonderful actor in. But Ralph and Will decided that they needed to get someone that was of
Native American.
Indigenous
Indian
person.
Yes, indigenous.
wow.
Wow, that's
Good
big.
for them.
So-
That's so
forward
cool.
thinking.
They said that they will not work on the show, so we did a little bit of a strike, and they recast it over the weekend, and we started, and they brought in an actual indigenous actor.
Now you
And
said Ralph and Will.
Ralph and Will. They said they would not work with the other actor.
No, Ralph and Will.
Ralph Waite
Ralph
and Will
Waite.
Gear.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
Daddy and Grandpa.
All right, who's ready for some Waltons trivia? We can all play,
Okay.
except for me because I have the answers. Waltons trivia. Number 1, who are the only 2 actors to appear in every episode of The Waltons?
Well, I'm probably down there as one of them. But
Yes.
But and then the other one would be probably Mary McDonough or John Walmsley.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty much all of us did all the shows. There were a couple of shows. Like I think there was a couple for Judy that she was pregnant, and then we did a 2-hour show, and they didn't know where the placement of that show was going to be. So what they did is they said, you know what, we're going to keep you out of this one because we might show the 2-hour before it. So there was some of that kind of stuff. But she was there all the time, and
Yeah.
I mean, there might be one episode here and there that she wasn't in, and Mary might have missed one because she might have been sick that day or something like that. But she was originally in the script, so we
Right.
can give them the credit, can't we?
Of course.
Okay.
This is our game. We make the rules. Number 2, Eric's character Ben is named after whom?
Well, that would have been Daddy's brother, Ben.
And he,
He died in the war, World War I.
right.
Yeah.
Very good. You're doing well.
Hey.
So far, it's 2 for 2. Okay.
Very good.
like
Which
I've
of
been
the following Academy, this is a tricky question that I composed.
Oh.
Which of the following Academy Award winners did not appear on the Waltons? Sissy Spacek, Ron Howard, Tom Hanks, Ned Beatty, Beulah Bondi.
Well, give me the names again.
Tom Hanks.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I was going
Well,
to say.
Tom Hanks, yeah.
Yeah.
He wasn't in it, but all the rest were.
The rest
Yeah.
were.
Yeah.
And a lot more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some wonderful performances in the Waltons. Number 4, The Waltons was commissioned by CBS as a result of negative backlash against the network's rural purge of the early 1970s, a series of cancellations of several rural-themed shows. Which of these canceled rural shows had been housed in the Waltons' home? They were using your house.
Mayberry RFD was from that show.
Exactly.
It was in the same house.
Yeah, so if you watch reruns of Mayberry RFD,
The barn.
the one with Ken Berry,
Yeah.
you'll see the Waltons' house. And number 5, is Richard Thomas now older than Will Geer was when he began playing Grandpa?
Yes. Yes, and I think we're all older than Grandma at this point.
So to give you the numbers, Richard Thomas is now a young 71, and Will Geer was 70 during the first season of the Waltons.
I saw Richard in
sisters.
To Kill a Mockingbird, and he was breathtaking.
Wasn't he amazing?
Really good. It was a really great
Never
performance.
ages. He looks
No, he looks
great.
exactly the
But
same.
the energy, but the script was
yeah.
by Aaron Sorkin was
Yeah.
just unbelievable.
Yeah.
And we actually saw it twice. We took the kids one night, and then we did a date on another night. But
really-
it was so brilliant.
And I always thought that the courtroom scene was the most dramatic in the whole book anyway, so it was great that he concentrated on
Yeah.
that. And it blew up. It was wonderful.
Yeah, they did good. I'm glad you saw it.
Another thing that you talk about is the introduction of the miniseries that sort of enveloped everybody's imagination, starting with Roots, and how that became an opportunity for, they were sort of fact-based miniseries where people could learn some real history, and that became a huge thing. Can you imagine binge watching Roots all in one night? How would be impossible. But I loved it. I thought that was a really positive move in the part of television.
Yeah, well, there was Rich Man, Poor Man started,
Right, I forgot about
the miniseries really.
North and South.
North and South, Winds of War. It was the first time that it really was the first binge watching when you think about it.
Right.
It was on every night there for that week.
Yeah,
and every,
Roots, yeah.
I think Rich Man, Poor Man was every week, but then they took it to the next level with Roots every night, and the family watched it together. There were 2 TVs in the house, but mostly there was that one television where everybody sat down and watched it together. So the experience was not just, oh, that really affects me, but it affects us at the same time.
And then you can discuss it.
And then
Well,
you can discuss
kids,
it.
great
That was-
pieces of American history.
Oh, absolutely.
But that
And-
was the water cooler energy. We did
absolutely.
And the only thing on right now that has the water cooler is sports. Because it's the only thing that we watch and we actually talk in real time. Because everything else, everyone's afraid to talk about because it might be that they're going to watch it this weekend or whatever. So they're watching on their
Sports
own.
is the only thing that's going to save network television because prime time is getting killed by streaming.
Yep.
There is no more appointment television where everybody sits down and watches Seinfeld with a family. Everybody can stream whatever they want on their phone and everything. But sports, the live sports event, is still the go-to event for family viewing.
But again, here it is many years later for us. When I talk to the fans, they watch the show, and not only do they love the show, but it reminds of them sitting with their parents or their grandparents or their brothers or their sisters who are no longer there. It reminds them of those times of sitting together because, like you said, they were watching the shows together. They all got together at 8 o'clock on Thursday nights, and they watched the show together. So,
and the
I have a
clarification-
memory of laying on my parents' bed watching the Waltons because for some reason there other people in the house were watching another show. And usually my parents' bedroom wasn't open.
well, what year was this now? What, his first season or many seasons in?
Seasons in.
Because
you
Welcome
know.
Back, Kotter was another one that probably, if you have
Yeah.
some siblings, they probably
And then
wanted to see
sometimes
that.
my mom would come and sit on the bed and watch it with me.
Okay.
And we just had this. She started saying, just to make fun of you guys because it was fun. She started saying, "You smell like a pine cone," which who wouldn't want to? And there's air fresheners that smell. And I'm like, "No, you smell like a pine cone." We were suburban
think-
Buffalo kids
yeah.
trying to pretend that we knew what it was like to smell like a pine cone.
Well, I think
Okay.
I think it's a compliment.
The clarification is with popular culture in particular, it's the core of the core message of the book, Retroactive Television, is not that TV is educational like PBS, but TV is educational pop culture. The pop culture version or the mainstream entertainment version of TV is educational. It's an untapped resource. The way I feel it and the way I talk about it in the book is an untapped resource of education that people didn't sit down and say, "Hey, I want to be a great independent career woman because of Mary Tyler Moore." They didn't sit down directly, and that didn't happen. But ultimately, that was the
Seeped in.
outcome.
It's
Seeped in.
crafting our awareness of ourselves and our society in ways that are subliminal or right on the nose. You know, you might watch an episode of something and walk away going, that, you know, they made a good point. But like you talk about Westerns as being all little morality plays. And they really were. They were some good writers. They had a beginning, a middle, and end. They were well. If you watch a rerun of Gunsmoke, you're like,
gosh.
wow.
The first 6 years of Gunsmoke, those half-hour black and whites are amazing. And I think when they stretched it to an hour, there was no reason to do it. It got to be, if you watch those first half hours and then you watch the hour color episodes later, it's like, you know what, dudes? You should have just left it a half hour because it was just dead air later on.
And the morality was black and white too in some of those things.
Ooh.
You could walk away with that.
And you got Dennis Weaver, which
Oh,
come
he
on.
was terrific. They were all terrific. Doc, that guy what a natural actor.
yeah.
One of the
Mil Bernstone.
formats of TV that's survived and been reinvented every once in a while, but seems to have lived as long as television is the procedural. You know, you had Perry Mason and Matlock, and then you've got every Dick Wolf show that eats up, 100% of NBC primetime.
Well, the difference is, in my opinion, is that you watch Perry Mason. I mean, that's just film TV noir, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, they were just genius. But you watch the newer shows, it's the same scene. Every time you put that show on, there he's doing the interrogation. That's the same one. It's the same scene. I don't see any drama. I don't meet any characters. I just see these individuals, the lawyer, the attorney, the cop, interrogating the criminal, and that's it. And that's the same scene every week. Perry Mason, no. Perry Mason, there were these beautiful stories. I think Law and Order. Law and Order. Perry Mason, in many ways, was there because they set up the story and then they'd attack it in the last half hour in court. But it's very, very repetitive today, whereas Perry Mason was not. Owen Marshall, counselor at law, The Defenders with E.G. Marshall, and Robert Reed, who would later play. That was ahead of its time. Richard made one of his first TV appearances as like 9 years old on The Defenders.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, it was pretty amazing.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He was like acting
knows his
forever.
stuff.
He knows a lot of stuff. So, Herbie, let's talk for a moment about after-school specials, because the reason, and Dina's going to love this conversation, because here's the thing. They're fascinating because they impacted us at young ages, but they're not rerun. So all you have is the one viewing of them at 12 or 14, and we've probably only watched them once, but then you kind of describe them in your book as having awesomely literal titles. Give us
Did I say
the
that?
kids are like, tell the kid in the title what it's about. So give us.
Now
some-
that's the one example or exception of popular TV becoming directly educational. Those things were created to be educational, and they were so unique. They came on after school.
Sure.
But they were original productions made for kids.
Absolutely.
I did
And they
two
were
of them.
well. You did too. What were your titles?
Which Mother is Mine?
Sure.
And
That comes up.
and I forget the name of the other one.
Well,
And the reason they went away is because of the deregulation of children's television by the FCC, right? They didn't. Wasn't there a mandate that they had to have a certain number of hours of children's programming directed at a certain young demographic?
Yeah,
every week?
that-
And then in the Reagan administration,
Yes.
that all went away.
Yes, in the 80s, things changed big.
Yeah, I think they just do it on Saturdays with the cartoons. They just that satisfies our needs.
Yeah.
So they just because they were expensive productions compared to putting on something else that they would have been able to do that was repeats of something that they did and they didn't pay the actors. So.
But Herbie, talk about some of the topics addressed. Maybe Dina, you can look up what Eric was on besides Which Mother Is Mine, and some of the titles and some of the topics addressed were really actually very pertinent to young people who did not know that they weren't the only person with this issue.
Well, and yes, and there were the issue-oriented ABC after-school specials just right at the same time that they started doing the issue-oriented TV movies at night.
Oh, right.
Like A Case of Rape was, the first issue-oriented TV movie. As far as the ABC after-school special that affected me the most, and I can't think of the title, but it was where, I think it was, I can't think of the title, but the little boy died, his cat died. his cat, that was the first time that for a young audience that you would have deal with death. I think probably since Bambi, at least on TV. And it really, really affected me. I never felt, now this is a personal thing, I never felt that sad watching a TV show as I did, because a character that I became familiar with died. A cat, whether or not, but it was still a character.
Well, now they turned it into a
it's pets.
procedural where they'd figure out who murdered the cat.
Yeah.
Cat DNA.
Yeah.
I guess you didn't watch our one when the raccoon died, or
I watched every single one of
or the cat died on ours.
No, my favorite episode, first of all, the first 5 years of the show is my favorite. But I love the where the deer, or not the deer, right?
Yeah, the
deer.
fawn, yeah.
The fawn, where the two kids save the fawn.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, what happened to your raccoon, Eric?
It
Yeah.
just died.
Well, you piqued her interest.
Just died.
It was your raccoon?
No, it was Elizabeth's.
Oh, she
Cammy.
loved that raccoon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She loved the raccoon.
So we have to talk about Talk TV. First of all, the gentleman that just passed away, God rest his soul.
Jerry Springer. I just listened to a podcast about him on This American Life driving home last night. That guy had a very interesting life. Go ahead.
Yeah. Geez, I forgot what I was going to say. But anyway.
Talk shows.
No, but he even admits himself that he was the ringmaster for the decline of Western civilization. That's a pretty good cell phone.
It's an interesting thing, because he says that, just like Don Rickles, who I really think was hysterical, but everybody said he was the nicest guy in the world, and he really didn't mean it. Okay, but he said it.
Yeah, he said it, and people think it. Yeah,
And same thing with Jerry Springer. He's a wonderful guy. He's a great human being. But look at what he did.
He wrought.
It's like you say you're playing a part. It's called The Jerry Springer Show, and your name is Jerry Springer, and you're saying these things to these people. So you can't separate yourself from it. Go ahead.
I have a feeling about him the same as I have about Maury Povich. They're like slum landlords. They would never be caught dead in a restaurant with any of the guests on that show.
Absolutely.
They're just picking money out of their pockets and twisting their little sad minds.
And
around.
laughing about it all the way to the
And laughing about it all the way to the bank. And there's no real cultural advancement we make from these shows. It's just awful.
Yeah. No,
It
and
is showing
Geraldo's
humanity at its worst.
There it is. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But you're also getting people who agree. Well, I know that you're not that mad at your mother-in-law, but could you throw a chair at her for television? And
well, they encourage that.
Yeah,
that's the sad
exactly.
thing. I mean, that started with Geraldo in the late '80s when he broke his nose and the first chair was thrown, and that was the end of that. And Merv Griffin was gone. There was no
May
more.
as well have thrown a chair at Merv.
But it's also showing that allure of that ambulance chasing, rubbernecking energy of humanity, which is sad.
You can find that in the political culture we find ourselves in now. Somebody turned over a rock.
Going to go deep with us right now, aren't you?
No, I'm not going to get into that, but there is.
Yeah.
I mean, some of these extreme people and all the gun violence and everything, it's man's inhumanity to man times 3. Dina has a question.
I think I'm kind of a believer of things have to get worse before they get better. Yeah, I think we had to kind of fall down far. But now we're kind of having a reckoning with that, right? Like the way that everyone is, kind of realizing how badly we treated celebrities, how badly we treated Britney Spears, how we kind of allowed the fame of, people that have achieved that level of fame to just be treated as non-humans. And we're all kind of dealing with that now. So, I mean, Jerry Springer had to be there to kind of bring us down to the depths, but now we're kind of healing from that, I feel as a society.
Maury Povich is still smoking along.
He is. I did his show actually in the 90s when my first Bewitched book came out, and I did the show with Aaron Murphy, who played Tabitha, and he tried to I wanted to go on and talk about love and everybody getting along with each other, no matter how different they were. And he definitely, turned it, but I handled it well.
How do you turn that?
Well, he did. He turned it.
Okay.
And it was something that I felt uncomfortable with, but I didn't feed into that. I just tried to.
I think he was trying to allege that Darren 1 was the real father.
Well, Darren 1 was the real father. Well, the way I look at it, he was the real father of Tabitha, and Darren 2 was the real father of Adam, who was Tabitha.
Let's talk about Elizabeth Montgomery. You seem to have a particular fixation on
I really don't see these. Yeah, well, I mean, Eric did. Eric appeared, one of his first pre-Waltons appearances was on Bewitched, and he played a character named
Herbie.
Oh my goodness.
which I finally had something to identify.
Universe.
Oh, it was crazy.
I mean.
Let me tell you, it was a crazy moment. Elizabeth Montgomery was an amazing human being. I just finished, of course.
Your 17th book on her.
No, but a documentary, which you were part of.
Really?
Elizabeth Montgomery, A Bewitched Life, which Eric was interviewed for. I served as one of the executive producers, one of the writers, and one of the on-screen commentators. And AMS Productions, AMS Pictures was amazing. People at Reels were so behind what we were trying to do with that.
Is it streaming anywhere? I'd like to see it.
It just debuted on Reels 2 weeks ago. It was streaming on Peacock for a little bit. So I'll let you know when it's going to be rerun. But I'm very proud of that because that was something I wanted to do for 30 years. And I pitched it in like 2015 originally, and it finally happened. But Elizabeth was a special person to me because she was wealthy. She came from a wealthy upbringing. Her parents were Robert Montgomery, major movie star. Her mother was Elizabeth Allen, Broadway actress. And somehow, some way, she did not retain any form of arrogance. She was very down to earth. And her parents instilled that in her. And she instilled that in turn in her children, who are super people in real life. Rebecca Asher is actually a director, took after her father, William Asher, who directed the show, Bewitched. And so she then took that down-to-earth persona and transferred it to Samantha, and she made everybody like and believe in witches because she was so likable and believable in that role. Eric, take it away because you were there.
You were talking about before the Academy Award people that we had on our show. And, again, we had the Beulah Bondies, and I remember working with her, and it was unbelievable working with her. And the others got their Oscar nominations later on and after the show. But working with Elizabeth, it was like having a movie star. I was lucky enough to do some movie work before the show. I did some Disney films and stuff like that. And she reminded me on that level. She didn't remind me of it, if I can say it, like a TV actress. She was like a movie star when I met her. There was a grace about her that was not typical of someone in the industry. And she was just, and again, what is a little 12-year-old or 11-year-old get in 1 week? It was obviously enough that I remembered her and meeting her. It was that moment where I went, oh wow, she's impressive. I will remember her.
Right.
And that's pretty cool for, when you're on a show for 4 or 5 days that you have that kind of memory from it.
Now, did she make you disappear or turn into a frog? Or
no, mine was Darren turned into a boy.
Okay.
And then I was going to go play basketball with him. So there was so again, just to bring it up to a Walton thing, Dick Sargent at that point is playing Darren. Right. He becomes a child, so I have a boy that works with me, and we run off and play. However, fast forward a few years, and now Dick Sargent's a guest on our show. Oh. And while I'm in the war, he is he's I think a sergeant on our show. So again, I remember being on the set with him, and I reminded him that I was on his show, and he goes, and I said, "Now you're on my show," and he goes, "Good job."
That's so subtle.
So it was very,
also, I think
cool.
Dick Sargent was destined to play a sergeant at some point.
I think so.
Yeah.
Well, then there was that movie Sergeant York, which always freaked me out as a kid because Dick York and then Dick Sargent. And
there's a lot going on right there.
Before we wrap up, I have to ask you about late night television. We talked about Mr. Carson earlier, but I sort of lament the fact that late night television doesn't have the impact on the American culture like it did back in Johnny and Merv's day, only because there's so much. But First of all, the most important thing he did was to sort of be a barometer to the thought process of Americans during political times with his monologue. Prick but don't draw blood. He made fun of everybody. But now you have all three shows doing monologues that are heavy in current events jokes. You have The Daily Show. You have Bill Maher. So all that energy that people are looking for somebody to help them make up their mind about how they feel sort of amortized over a bunch of platforms. I don't think those shows have the impact they used to. Also, with the Carson show, it was such a variety. It was America's first exposure to, say, Beverly Sills and opera music. It was America's first exposure to maybe a 16-year-old violin virtuoso from Japan. It was an intelligent conversation about astronomy with Carl Sagan. It was all those things. And for some, talking about rural or middle America, this was people's first exposure to some of these topics.
Well,
the old talk shows.
The importance aspect of why those shows were so great were because of those people. I mean, Johnny Carson let the guest talk, like you guys are letting us do.
Occasionally.
He really didn't make that show about him. He did his thing in the first monologue, and then he would sit down, and he really seemed interested in the guest.
He was a wonderful audience, especially for comedians.
You were there.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yep.
And on these new talk shows, it's about them. Everybody's doing these skits, and the Tonight Show, it's turned into Saturday Night Live every
because
night.
they want something that will work on the internet. So they're working, they're striving, or they're aiming beyond the show itself to.
And it is working. And let me say, obviously, this is whatever they're doing today is working for an awful lot of people. But I still think that if you're in a room and you only get to watch one show, that they're given the choice. They can see a snippet of each. If it's going to be The Walking Dead or That Girl, I would think that many people were going to choose the charming, brightly lit That Girl with the two likable characters. And that's a real important key word in shows and classic shows is the likability. And as I said before, the charm. The characters can be unlikable. But as long as the performance as those characters are likable, we're good. In other words, JR. JR was not a likable character, but it was Larry Hagman's likable performance as that character.
That's interesting. Carson's been one of my heroes my whole life.
How many times did you do his show?
8. Because I was right upstairs, I did it with Johnny, Jay Leno, Joan Rivers, and Gary Shandling. I was like the go-to accordion. For
someone canceled.
Yeah. But I really realized, the timbre of his voice, his gentleness, his ability to listen. When I would listen to his shows on Sirius XM radio, you couldn't see him, but you could hear him. And I thought, wow, he was so comfortable, even just to listen to in the car. He had that great gift. That middle American Nebraska timbre to his voice.
So,
when you talk about a dichotomy, though, like we started the show talking about Little Richard, but with Johnny, it was like that. How could one guy be so comfortable on camera and so uncomfortable off camera?
He was definitely.
But I thought Letterman did a great job.
Letterman's my guy.
I thought he was
He
brilliant,
reinvented
too.
the format without really reinventing it. He just kind of stretched it.
Well, he just made it relevant for the times.
Yes, I will go with that.
Big fan.
It was a combination of silliness and intelligence.
And James Corden, what he did with the karaoke and the car interviews and stuff,
Big
I
fan.
thought that was very, very good.
I thought it was very good. He's a very talented performer.
He's got a great harmony ear, and I appreciate that.
No, he's got a lot of talent. I'll give him that.
Yeah, so much good stuff.
I'm wondering what your opinion is on Seinfeld, because that is a show about some really unlikable people.
I am so glad you brought this up.
Show about
Yay,
nothing.
Dina.
No, it's a real important transition of what's going on with that show. Those first 5 years were genius. Afterwards, I don't know, they were like the Bizarro Seinfeld, okay? The characters, everybody started trying to be obnoxious, like Kramer. The characters were always unlikable. But in the last few years of the show, even though they were making $1 bazillion a year, the performances became unlikable. You didn't like, at least I didn't, Jerry Seinfeld's performance as Jerry. I didn't like Jason's performance as George. Everybody became obnoxious, where they were just adorably unlikable before, and they were not that, in my opinion.
You talk in your book.
So thank you so much for that amazing question.
It's an amazing question, but
back to what you said, that like performance is everything.
Performance is everything, and the performances were lacking because, quite frankly, I think Larry David wasn't there. In those later years.
So it's hard to hit the right note.
You know?
Well, you talk a lot about Buffalo Bill as being an example of the first show with an anti-hero. But there were those of us, once you understood this is what they're doing, like you were in. You know what I mean? And then there were so many shows that followed, like even Will and Grace, for example. I don't think any of the four of them are, fantastic people. But, as performers in that television show, there's no one ever funnier in the writing. So, like, just take Grace alone or Will alone or Karen or Jack. They're all selfish, right? But the way that it meshed and the way it was written and the way that they could just really get in there and go over the top, that's what made it glorious.
Well, I think the show was terrific, and I think the best way to explain what I'm trying to say is Happy Days.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. The first year and a half, adorable, sweet little show. And then they decided that Fonzie would be the center. I know I love Fonzie too, but it became a completely different show because it was no longer filmed without an audience. Then they brought the audiences, and then the actors. Something happens to actors; they start interacting with the audience instead of playing to the camera.
So I have a question for you.
When
we interviewed Tony Dow, he said,
"Oh, what a wonderful human being!
One of the nicest people we ever had on the show. And really, it was only a couple months before he passed away.
And this is a question for Eric, because Tony said, you're working with, the name of the show is Leave It to Beaver. It's Jerry has his own show. He's a little boy. So the producers and the writers said to Joe Connolly and Bob Mosier, and I think Leave It to Beaver is genius because of the nuance. But they said to the kids, don't watch. Mm-hmm. You're going to start playing a version of what you saw rather than. Right. So are you able to really say to little kids, especially when it says, and Jerry Mathers as the beaver, how do you tell that kid not to watch? He's going to see it. And how were you told, don't watch, we just want you to be yourselves? And does that change
they never said don't watch. Mm-hmm. I mean, no, we had watch parties and everything else. Mm-hmm. I chose after the first year that I didn't need to see it. Back then, the only time to watch it was live,
right,
or watch it over the summer in repeats. So I would usually watch them sometimes in the repeat time, or like at the end of the year I would watch them when we were not in production. So it was just a choice that I just felt that I didn't need to see what was going on. The other part of the fame and all that other stuff, that's irrelevant to the whole thing. It was just a matter of whether I wanted to learn something by watching myself on TV. And there was nothing for me to learn on a weekly basis to see what that show ended up looking like.
Right, because you were so busy.
I already knew what was going on.
But I just wonder if, like, what Herbie's saying is you actually start playing a caricature of what you started out playing.
Well, I think that, look, it's so tough to do a show and then after many years still have that initial wonderful energy that you have. I felt that our show, after the first 5 years, did a little bit of a jumping of the shark. Again,
how could it not? How could any show not?
Well, Richard left. And if the show is about the writer and the author and the creator and the original, and
didn't the cinematography even change?
It was changed. I thought that the hair, the makeup, everything, they laxed a little bit here and there. Maybe we were complaining about the hair. We didn't want to get those kind of haircuts anymore. So they acquiesced. They didn't want to bother. So those things can happen along the way. The writers were on to different shows that Laura Marr was doing at the time, and the director. So it's tough to keep a show, like you were saying about Seinfeld, it's tough to keep a show going. So what do? They almost become caricatures of what they were. And I'm not saying our show went in that direction, but there was times like, we got older. So what do? They cast Aunt Rose with the two kids in the 8th season to try to bring some young energy back onto the show. Did they need to do that? No, but that's what they chose to do.
What I always appreciated about executives in the early days of television, you were there when Grant Tinker was the head of entertainment, is that There was more gut in programming. Grant Tinker, for example, Hill Street Blues and St. Elsewhere were not successful at the beginning, but he had the forethought to let them grow and develop and find their audience, and would leave them on 2, 3, 4 years. And they did that with Seinfeld too. The guy that really championed Seinfeld was that late night guy named Rick. What was the guy's name? He passed away recently. Rick, he was the head of late night. Anyway, he was sort of the champion of Seinfeld, and they just sat with it, and it wasn't doing well. And they just, but somebody had the instinct and the guts to stick on a show for 2 or 3 years. They don't do that anymore.
Well,
if it tanks after 3 episodes, you're out.
Well, you do that with music again. They used to give guys 3 albums to try to figure out what they were doing. We don't do that either. We don't do anything that allows an artist to figure out their path. We just say, okay, what do you got to show for it? And next, so there's no time to develop. And it's something that the audience is losing out on.
I agree.
Yeah.
Unless they make their own show and put it up on the YouTube.
And that's what a lot of people are doing successfully.
All right, what else do we need to know? We've got Herbie's book and...
Read the title of this tome.
Herbie?
Retroactive Television, an in-depth perspective of classic TV social circuitry. It's not a history of classic television. It's a perspective on the positive influence that some classic TV shows have had on society.
I said it before, nobody knows more about classic television. Just having a conversation with you is so much fun. There are great photographs in here. There and great American television history. And it will make you both sad, like, where the hell have we gone? And second of all, it will just describe the best years, the halcyon years, the 60s and 70s.
And we're going to be giving away a book. If you want to go to MediaPathPodcast.com and sign up for our newsletter, we're going to be giving away a book signed by Herbie. And it could be your very own. All right. Eric, is there anything we should know about you or where to find you online?
No.
You can find
No,
Eric.
I'm just happy to be here with you guys today.
Eric's going to be right here on our podcast until he drives away. Thank you so much for joining us. We would love to continue this conversation with you on Instagram and Twitter, where we are at MediaPathPod, and on Facebook, where our show page is MediaPath Podcast, and our Facebook group is MediaPath with Fritz and Wheezy Podcast Community. You can find full video podcast episodes loaded with bonus visual content on our YouTube channel, MediaPath Podcast. You can write to us at MediaPathPodcast@gmail.com. And if you enjoy this show, please give us a nice rating in Apple Podcasts and talk about us at family gatherings, at the Wendy's drive-thru, or on social media. You can sign up for the Media Path Post at Mediapath Podcast. We just named our newsletter, at MediaPathPodcast.com. It enters your inbox once a week, just once a week. It is full of photos, quizzes, fun, and links to the newest episode and to everything we've been talking about on the show. We want to thank our guests, Herbie J. Pilato and Eric Scott. Our team includes Dina Friedman, John Maddox, Bill Filipiak, Thomas Hubble, Mason Brown, Garrett Arch, Nick Broussard, and you. Our theme music is by me and John Maddox. I am Louise Palanker here with Fritz Coleman and Eric Scott and Herbie J. Pilato. Be well and wise, and we will see you along the media path. Herbie brought us pies. From where, Herbie? From where?
Polly's Pie
From
is
Polly's
my
Pies.
favorite ever.
Shout out.